The blizzard of 1883 didn't just bury the trails of the Wyoming Territory, it buried secrets. Silas Halloway was a man who preferred the company of wolves to women, living high on Granite Peak where the air was too thin for lies. He thought he had escaped his past. But when a frozen wagon appeared on his ridge, carrying a woman with eyes like bruised violets and two shivering children, Silas knew his solitude was over. They weren't just running from the cold. They were running from a devil wearing a badge. And Silas was the only thing standing between them and a shallow grave. The wind howled through the cracks of the timber cabin like a dying animal. It was a sound Silas Halloway had grown accustomed to over the last 10 years. Up here, at the edge of the timberline in the Bighorn Mountains, the wind was the only voice that dared to speak to him. Silas was a giant of a man, his beard thick with gray streaks that matched the iron of his eyes. He sat by the hearth, cleaning a Winchester 1873 rifle. He didn't expect trouble. Trouble usually didn't have the stamina to climb this high. But habits from the war died hard. He stood up, his knees cracking, and walked to the frosted window. The storm outside was a white curtain, erasing the world. But then he saw it. A dark shape, unnatural and blocky. Emerging from the tree line about 200 yards down the ridge. Silas narrowed his eyes. It was a wagon. A covered wagon, listing heavily to the left, one wheel shattered. Fools, he grunted. No one crossed the pass in November. Not if they wanted to keep their toes. He grabbed his buffalo hide coat and jammed his hat low over his brow. He didn't want to go out there. He didn't want to save anyone. He wanted to be left alone with his ghosts. But Silas was many things. A killer, a hermit, a veteran. But he wasn't a monster. He trudged through waist-deep drifts, the wind biting at his exposed cheeks. As he neared the wagon, the smell hit him first. Not death, but fear. The horses were already dead, frozen in their traces. Silas ripped open the canvas flap at the back of the wagon. Huddled under a pile of thin, patchwork quilts was a woman. She was pale, her lips blue, her arm wrapped fiercely around a bundle. Beside her lay a boy, no older than 10, shivering so violently his teeth chattered like dice in a cup. The woman looked up. Her eyes were green, startlingly bright against the gloom. She raised a shaking hand, holding a rusty, terrifyingly small revolver. Don't you come near them, she whispered, the gun wavering. Silas didn't flinch. He just reached out, wrapped his massive gloved hand around the barrel, and gently pushed it down. Ma'am, the pea shooter won't stop a bear, and it certainly won't stop the frostbite taking your boy's fingers. You can shoot me later. Right now, you need fire. She stared at him, her strength failing, and slumped back against the wood. Silas worked quickly. He scooped up the boy, Toby, throwing him over his shoulder like a sack of grain. He then grabbed the woman. She was clutching a baby girl, wrapped so tight she was invisible. Can you walk? Silas barked over the wind. I think my leg is broken, she gasped. Silas cursed under his breath. He shifted the boy to his left arm and scooped the woman and the baby up with his right. He was carrying 3 lives through a blizzard, a weight that would have crushed a lesser man. But Silas had carried heavier burdens. He had carried the memory of burning Atlanta for 20 years. He kicked open the cabin door and brought them into the sanctuary of the firelight. The smell of pine and wood smoke seemed to revive the boy in. Silas deposited them on his bearskin rug before the hearth. Don't touch the fire yet, Silas warned, his voice gravelly. You warm up too fast, your skin will scream. He went to the stove, pouring broth from an iron pot into tin mugs. When he turned back, the woman was watching him. The fear hadn't left her eyes, but the cold was receding. I'm Clara, she whispered. Clara O'Malley. Silas didn't introduce himself. He just handed her the mug. Drink. Then tell me who chased a woman and 2 kids up a mountain in a storm like this. Because people don't run into a blizzard unless the thing behind them is worse. Clara took a sip, her hands trembling. A man named Josiah Paddock. Silas froze. The name hung in the air, heavier than the smoke. He knew Josiah Paddock. Everyone in the territory knew the cattle baron of Red Rock. He was a man who bought land with blood and signed deeds with lead. Paddock? Silas asked, his voice dropping an octave. What does a vulture like Paddock want with a widow? Clara looked down at her baby, tears freezing on her lashes. He says my husband stole something from him. He says he owns us until the debt is paid. Silas looked at the fire, the flames dancing in his dark eyes. He had come up here to forget the cruelty of men. But it seemed the world had found him anyway. 3 days passed, and the storm refused to break. The cabin, usually a sanctuary of silence, was filled with the sounds of life. And it grated on Silas's nerves. The baby, little Sarah, cried at night. The boy, Toby, was constantly touching things. Silas's carving knife, his whittling wood, the jar of bullets on the mantel. Don't touch that. Silas snapped on the second morning as Toby reached for a jagged piece of shrapnel kept on a shelf. What is it? Toby asked, undeterred by the giant's growl. A reminder, Silas said, snatching it away. Go help your mother peel the potatoes. Clara was sitting in the rocking chair Silas had carved years ago, a chair he never sat in. Her leg was splinted with cedar branches and strips of an old shirt. She watched him with a calculating gaze. She wasn't the fragile flower he had pulled from the snow. There was steel in her spine. You don't like us being here, Clara said, her voice steady. Silas was oiling his boots. He didn't look up. I don't like noise. I don't like complications. You and your kin are both. We didn't ask to crash, she retorted. And I intend to pay you for your trouble once we get to my brother in Oregon. Silas scoffed. Oregon is 1,000 miles that way. And with a broken leg, you aren't making it past the privy. I have money, she lied. Silas knew she was lying. He had checked the wagon before the snow buried it completely. There was nothing there but clothes and a Bible. I don't need your money, Mrs. O'Malley. I need you to stay quiet until the pass clears. Then I'll take you down to the Marshal and Cody. No, she lurched forward, wincing in pain. Not the Marshal. The Marshal is Paddock's cousin. If you take us to Cody, you're handing us a death sentence. Silas stopped scrubbing his boot. He looked at her, really looked at her. She was beautiful, in a worn-out, desperate sort of way. Her hair was the color of dried wheat, and her hands were rough from work. Paddock, Silas muttered. He's a land grabber. Why chase a wagon for 3 days over a debt? He usually just burns the house down and moves on. Clara hesitated. She looked at Toby, who was busy trying to feed a piece of jerky to Silas's old hound Buster. My husband, Arthur, Clara began, her voice shaking. He worked as Paddock's accountant for 6 years. He kept the ledgers. The real ledgers, the ones that show who Paddock bribed, who he killed, and where the bodies are buried. Silas raised an eyebrow. Arthur stole the books? No, Clara said. He memorized them. Arthur had a mind like a steel trap. He could remember every number, every date. Paddock found out Arthur was planning to go to the governor. They shot Arthur in the back while he was plowing the field. The room went silent. Silas felt a familiar tightness in his chest. The injustice of it. It tasted like bile. So Paddock wants you because he thinks Arthur wrote it down, Clara said. He thinks I have the ledger. But I don't. Arthur never wrote it down because he knew it would get us killed. Paddock won't stop until he tears my wagon apart and makes sure I can't talk. Silas stood up and walked to the window. The snow was stopping. The sun was trying to break through, casting long blue shadows across the peaks. He'll track the wagon, Silas said quietly. If his tracker is half as good as I think, he'll find the wreck by tomorrow noon. What do we do? Clara asked, clutching the arms of the rocker. Silas turned to her. For the first time, his face softened, just a fraction. I never had a wife, he said, the statement seemingly out of nowhere. I never had kids. Lived my whole life making sure I didn't have anything to lose. Because when you have things to lose, men like Paddock can own you. He walked over to the gun rack and pulled down a double-barreled shotgun, cracking it open to check the shells. But you're here now, Silas said, and I'll be damned if I man who shoots farmers in the back walk up my mountain. He looked at Toby. Boy, put that jerky down. You know how to load a magazine. Toby's eyes went wide. Yes, sir. Pa taught me. Good, Silas grunted. Because the quiet is over. We've got company coming. The silence of the mountain was shattered not by a gunshot, but by the crunch of frozen snow crust. Silas stood on the porch, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He had positioned Clara and the children in the root cellar beneath the cabin floorboards. It was a dark, earthen hole smelling of potatoes and damp soil, but it was the only place bulletproof enough to ease his mind. Stay down until I knock 3 times, Silas had told Toby, handing the boy a hunting knife. If anyone comes down there who isn't me, you stick them. You don't hesitate. Understand? Toby had nodded, his eyes wide but dry. The boy was growing up too fast, aged by fear. Silas hated it. It reminded him of the drummer boys in the war. Children forced to play men's games. Silas scanned the ridge. Through the scope of his Winchester, he saw them. 5 riders, struggling through the drifts. They weren't moving like lawmen, they were moving like predators. Leading them was a man in a black duster, riding a massive bay horse that looked as mean as its master. That was Dutch Van Doren, Paddock's head enforcer, a man rumored to have killed a marshal in Abilene and gotten away with it because Paddock paid the judge. Silas didn't wait for a parley. He didn't believe in words when men came armed to a stranger's home. He aimed not at the men, but at the snowbank above the narrow pass they were traversing. Crack. The rifle shot echoed like thunder. The bullet slammed into the overhanging drift. A sheet of snow, heavy and wet, slid down, blocking the path behind them. They were cut off. The riders halted, horses rearing. Dutch looked up, spotting Silas on the porch. He didn't look afraid, he looked annoyed. "Holloway." Dutch shouted, his voice carrying over the wind. "We ain't here for you, old man. Send out the girl and the brats, and we'll leave you to your misery." Silas racked the lever of his rifle. "This is private land, Dutch. You're trespassing. We got a warrant." Dutch lied, reaching into his coat. "Paddock's money isn't the law up here," Silas called back. "Turn around, or the next one takes your ear off." Dutch laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Get him, boys." The air erupted. Bullets chewed into the logs of the cabin, sending splinters flying. Silas didn't flinch. He kicked the heavy oak door shut and moved to the window loophole he'd cut years ago for wolves. He took a breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The first rider, a man Silas didn't recognize, spun out of his saddle, his shoulder exploding in red mist. He screamed, dropping into the snow. The others scrambled for cover behind the rocks. "Cover fire!" Dutch roared. Bullets shattered the window glass, showering Silas in shards. He felt a sting on his cheek but ignored it. He moved to the second loophole on the west wall. He knew this terrain. They didn't. He knew that the rock formation to the left offered poor cover because of the angle from the cabin. He waited. A hat peeked out. Silas fired. The hat flew off, and the man attached to it yelped, clutching a grazed scalp. "He's got us pinned," one of the hired guns shouted. "He's shooting like a damn demon." Silas moved constantly, never firing from the same spot twice. He was a ghost in his own home. But he knew this was just the opening act. They were testing his defenses, counting his shots. Suddenly, the shooting stopped. "Holloway." Dutch's voice came again. "You're fighting a losing battle. Paddock is coming up the trail with wagon. You know what he brings when he wants something done." Silas's blood ran cold. Dynamite. Paddock would blow the mountain apart to get what he wanted. Silas looked at the trapdoor in the floor. He couldn't hold them off forever. Not if they brought explosives. He needed to change the game. He needed to stop being the prey and become the hunter. Night fell early, draping the mountain in a suffocating darkness. The wind had picked up again, masking the sound of footsteps. Inside the cabin, Silas lifted the trapdoor. Clara emerged first, coughing from the dust. She looked at the shattered windows and the blood trickling down Silas's cheek. She didn't scream. She reached out and touched his face with a rag she'd dipped in water. "You're hurt," she whispered. "Glass cut. Nothing deep." Silas grunted. He looked at Toby and the baby, Sarah, who was miraculously asleep. "They've pulled back to the tree line. They're waiting for Paddock." Clara sat heavily on the bearskin rug. "Why are you doing this, Silas? You could have handed us over. They wouldn't have killed you." Silas sat opposite her, reloading his magazines by the dim light of the embers. "I saw a man beat a dog once in Cheyenne, just kicking it because it was in his way. I put that man in the hospital. I don't like bullies, Clara. And I don't like men who hunt children." He paused, looking at the fire. "And maybe I'm tired of being alone in this cabin. Maybe fighting for something feels better than rotting." Clara looked at him, her eyes searching his face. The connection between them was growing, forged in the heat of danger. It wasn't romance yet. It was survival, which was stronger. "Silas," she said softly, "I have to tell you the truth. The whole truth." Silas stopped loading. "I thought you did. I told you Arthur memorized ledgers," she said. "That was true. But I didn't tell you why Paddock is really coming yourself. He isn't coming for the numbers. He's coming because of what I took." Clara reached into her bodice and pulled out a small velvet pouch. She upended it into her palm. It was a ring. A massive, gaudy gold ring, set with a ruby the size of a pigeon's egg. It was the kind of ring a king would wear, or a man who thought he was a king. "That's Paddock's signet ring," Silas said, recognizing it immediately. Paddock used it to seal his deals. It was his symbol of power. "Arthur didn't just memorize the books," Clara said, her voice hard. "Before he died, he managed to steal this from Paddock's safe. Paddock can't access his accounts in San Francisco without the seal. He can't move his money. Without this ring, he's frozen out of his own empire." Silas let out a low whistle. "You didn't just steal from him. You crippled him. He killed my husband." Clara hissed, her face contorting with a rage that surprised Silas. "He left my children fatherless. I wanted him to hurt. I wanted him to panic. I wanted him to come for me so I could kill him." Silas stared at her. The fragile widow in the snow was gone. In her place was a woman consumed by vengeance. You used us as bait, Silas said slowly. You came up this mountain hoping I'd kill him for you. Clara flinched, shame warring with her anger. I heard stories about the ghost of Granite Peak. They said you were the best shot in the territory. I didn't have anywhere else to go, Silas. I'm sorry. Silas stood up, pacing the floor. He should be angry. He had been manipulated. She had brought a war to his doorstep on purpose. But when he looked at her, he didn't see a manipulator. He saw a mother backed into a corner, fighting with the weapons she had. He saw a reflection of himself 20 years ago. Angry, desperate, wanting the world to burn for what it took from him. You're a dangerous woman, Clara O'Malley, Silas murmured. Are you going to throw us out? She asked, her voice trembling. Silas walked over to the window, peering into the darkness. He saw the flicker of torches down the ridge. Paddock had arrived. No, Silas said, racking the slide of his shotgun. I'm not going to throw you out. Paddock thinks he's coming to slaughter a sheep. He doesn't know the sheep brought him to a wolf's den. He turned back to her, his eyes cold steel. If you want revenge, Clara, you better have the stomach for it. Because tonight, we aren't just surviving. We're going to end his reign, right here in the snow. Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the cabin. The front door blew inward, splintering off its hinges. Smoke billowed in. Get to the cellar, Silas roared, diving behind the overturned heavy oak table. Through the smoke, a figure stepped into the doorway. It wasn't Dutch. It was Josiah Paddock himself, clad in a fur coat, holding a stick of dynamite in one hand and a gold-plated revolver in the other. His face was twisted in a manic grin. Honey, I'm home, Paddock sneered. And I want my ring back. Silas raised his shotgun, but before he could fire, Paddock tossed the dynamite. The fuse hissed like a viper coiled on the floorboards. In the fraction of a second Silas had left, the world narrowed down to a single, desperate calculation. He couldn't reach the dynamite. It had rolled too far near the hearth. He couldn't shoot it. He couldn't run. He looked at the heavy oak dining table, a slab of timber he had hewn from a lightning-struck pine 10 years ago. It was the only shield he had. Down, Silas roared. He didn't dive for cover. He dove for the table. With a grunt of exertion that tore at his old war wounds, Silas the legs out from under the heavy furniture, flipping it completely over. The thick tabletop slammed down, covering the trapdoor to the root cellar where Toby and the baby were hidden. Silas threw himself on top of the overturned table, curling his massive frame into a ball, pressing his face into the wood just as the world turned white. Boom! The sound wasn't a noise. It was a physical blow. A sledgehammer of compressed air slammed into the cabin, shattering the equilibrium of the mountain. The front wall disintegrated, turning logs into shrapnel. The windows blew out in a shower of diamond dust glass. Silas felt the cabin lift off its foundation and groan as it slammed back down. Then came the crushing weight. The roof beams above gave way, raining timber, stone, and heavy slate tiles down upon him. Something massive, the main ridge beam, struck him across the lower back and legs, pinning him to the overturned table with the force of a hydraulic press. Darkness swallowed him. When consciousness clawed its way back, it came with the taste of copper and sulfur. Silas coughed, his lungs burning from the thick, gray dust that filled the air. His ears were ringing with a high-pitched whine, drowning out the wind outside. He tried to move. He couldn't. His legs were trapped under the fallen beam. He reached instinctively for his shotgun, but his hands grasped only rubble. He was weaponless. He was pinned. He was a wolf caught in a steel trap. Through the haze of smoke and dust, a silhouette appeared in the gaping hole where the front door had been. The figure stepped over the wreckage, boots crunching on broken glass. It was Josiah Paddock. The cattle baron looked absurdly out of place in a ruin, dressed in a pristine fur-collared coat, his silver spurs jingling softly. He held a gold-plated revolver in one hand, the barrel still smoking slightly, though he hadn't fired a shot. He had let the dynamite talking. Well, Paddock said, his voice sounding distant and distorted through Silas's damaged ears. He waved a hand through the smoke, coughing politely. That certainly cleared the air. Behind him, Dutch Van Doren and two other men stepped into the room, their guns drawn. They scanned the wreckage, eyes cold and practiced. Check the corners, Dutch barked. Find the woman. Silas grit his teeth, straining against the timber pinning him. A groan escaped his lips. Paddock turned, his eyes landing on Silas. A cruel smile spread across his face. He walked over, stepping casually on a piece of Silas's broken carving work. You're a hard man to kill, Holloway, Paddock mused, looking down at the trapped giant. I'll give you that. Most men would be pasted on the walls by now. Go to hell. Silas rasped, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. I own the mortgage on hell, old man. Paddock chuckled. He crouched down, bringing his face close to Silas's. And right now, I'm calling in a debt. Where is she? Before Silas could answer, or spit in his face. A noise came from behind the collapsed hearth. "Found her," one of the henchmen shouted. Dutch reached behind the pile of rubble and dragged Clara out by her arm. She was coughing, her face smeared with soot, a nasty gash bleeding on her forehead. She fought him, clawing at his face, but she was dazed and overpowered. "Let me go," she screamed, her voice raw. Dutch threw her to the floor at Paddock's feet. Paddock straightened up, holstering his gun and looking down at her with a look of utter contempt. "Mrs. O'Malley," Paddock said smoothly, "you have something of mine." Clara looked up, her green eyes blazing with hatred. She wiped the blood from her eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about." The sound was sharp and sickening. Paddock backhanded her so hard her head snapped back. Silas roared, thrashing against the beam, but the wood didn't budge. "Don't lie to me." Paddock shouted, his facade of civility dropping instantly. "My accountant steals from me. He dies. His widow runs. I chase. Do you think I chased you through a blizzard for the pleasure of your company? Where's the ring?" Clara spat blood onto the floorboards. "I lost it. It fell in the snow when the wagon crashed." Paddock stared at her, his chest heaving. He grabbed her by the jaw, forcing her to look at him. "You're lying. Dutch, search her. Get your hands off her." Silas bellowed, straining until his vision blurred. Dutch ignored him. He roughly patted down Clara's coat, checking her pockets, ripping the lining. He checked her bodice. He checked her boots. He stood up, shaking his head. "She ain't got it, boss." Paddock's face turned a violent shade of red. He looked around the ruined cabin. He looked at the overturned table Silas was pinned on. "It's here," Paddock hissed. "She hid it. Or maybe," he looked at the table again, "maybe the brats have it." Clara's eyes went wide. The fear she hadn't shown for herself suddenly erupted for her children. "No, they aren't here. They ran off into the woods before you came." Paddock narrowed his eyes. "You're a terrible liar, Clara." "Dutch, move that table." "No," Clara shrieked, lunging for Paddock's leg. "Please, take me. Do whatever you want with me. Just leave them alone." Paddock kicked her away. He looked at the table, then at the heavy beam pinning Silas to it. It would take 3 men and a lever to move that timber. Too much work, Paddock decided, his voice turning cold and flat. He had the kerosene lantern that had miraculously survived the explosion, sitting on a tilted shelf. "If the ring isn't here," Paddock said, picking up the lantern, "gold melts at nearly 2,000 degrees. But it doesn't burn. We'll sift through the ashes tomorrow. And the kids?" Dutch asked, a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. "Collateral damage," Paddock said. He smashed the lantern against the wall. The oil splashed across the dry, splintered logs and the pile of fur pelts in the corner. The fire caught instantly, a hungry orange beast that leaped up the walls. The draft from the blown-out door fed it, turning the cabin into a wind tunnel of flame. "No!" Clara screamed, struggling to get up, but Dutch grabbed her hair, dragging her toward the door. "We're leaving!" Paddock yelled over the roar of the fire. He looked at Silas one last time. "You wanted to play the hero, Holloway? Then you can burn like a martyr." Paddock turned and walked out into the snow. Dutch dragged Clara, kicking and screaming, out into the night. "Silas," she screamed, her voice tearing with desperation. "Silas." Then she was gone. The darkness swallowed them. Silas was alone. The heat was instantaneous and blistering. The flames were licking across the ceiling now, dropping sparks onto his clothes. The smoke was thickening, turning from gray to black. He could feel the skin on his face tightening. He was going to die. He was going to burn alive, pinned to the floor of the home he had built to escape the world. He let his head drop, defeat washing over him. The beam was too heavy. Paddock had won. Wah-uh. The sound was faint, muffled by the thick oak of the table beneath him, but it cut through the roar of the fire like a knife. It was the baby. Sarah. Silas's eyes snapped open. The children were still alive. They were right underneath him, protected by the table, but trapped in a wooden box that was rapidly turning into an oven. If he died, they died. If he gave up, the fire would consume them all. Silas looked at the flames eating his home. A new terrifying strength flooded his veins. Not the strength of a soldier, but the strength of a protector. "Not today," Silas growled, gripping the splintered wood of the floor. "Not today, you son of a bitch." The world did not go black. It went red. The explosion had been a physical blow, a hammer of compressed air that had shattered the cabin's equilibrium. For a long moment, Silas lay in a void of ringing silence, his face pressed against the rough grain of the floorboards. The air was gone, replaced by a choking, sulphurous dust that tasted of pulverized stone and old violence. Then, the pain arrived. It started as a dull throb in his lower body and escalated instantly to a screaming, white-hot agony. A support beam, Likely one of the massive ponderosa pines he had felled himself a decade ago, had collapsed across his legs. It pinned him to the floor with the weight of a mountain. Silas coughed, a wet, racking sound that cleared the dust from his lungs but filled them with smoke. Above him, the roof was no longer a shelter, it was a kindling box. The dynamite had blown out the front wall, and the updraft was feeding the flames with voracious speed. The crackle of eating fire was deafening, sounding like 1,000 dry bones snapping at once. "Get up," a voice in his head hissed. It sounded like his old sergeant from the war. "Get up, Holloway. You don't die lying down." He tried to push himself up, but his left leg wouldn't respond. It was trapped fast. He could feel the heat radiating from the falling debris, singeing the hair on his arms, blistering the skin on his neck. "Mr. Silas?" It was muffled, coming from beneath him. Silas froze. The table. In the split second before the blast, he had overturned the heavy oak dining table over the trapdoor to the root cellar. He was lying on top of it, shielding the boy and the baby with his own body. "Toby?" Silas rasped, his throat raw. "You alive down there?" "It's hot," the boy whimpered. "The smoke is coming through the cracks." The fire was hungry. It was licking at the walls, climbing the curtains, dropping sparks onto Silas's coat. If he didn't move now, the table would catch, and the cellar would become an oven. Silas grit his teeth so hard he felt a molar crack. He planted his hands on the floorboards, ignoring the shards of glass and splinters digging into his palms. He focused every ounce of his will, every drop of adrenaline, into his shoulders and back. He roared, a guttural, animalistic sound that was lost in the roar of the flames. He pushed. Beam shifted. Just an inch. The agony in his leg was blinding, a jagged lightning bolt shooting up his spine. He pushed again, tears of exertion mixing with the soot on his face. The beam rolled. He dragged his legs free. His left leg was a mess of torn fabric and blood, twisted at a sickening angle just above the ankle. He couldn't stand on it. If he tried, he would pass out. "Open the door," Silas yelled, hammering his fist on the overturned table. The trapdoor pushed up, grating against the wood of the table. Toby's face appeared, streaked with tears and grime, eyes wide with terror. He was holding Sarah, who was wailing. A thin, high sound that cut through the chaos. "Give her to me," Silas commanded, shoving the pain into a dark corner of his mind. He took the baby, tucking her deep inside his buffalo coat, shielding her head with his hand. "Climb out, boy. Stay low. The air is better near the..." They were in the belly of the beast now. The cabin was disintegrating around them. A section of the loft collapsed, sending a shower of burning straw onto the spot where Silas had been lying seconds before. "The door is blocked," Toby screamed, pointing to the wall of flaming debris where the entrance used to be. "The window," Silas coughed, pointing to the loophole on the west wall. It was low, shattered, and jagged, but it was their only way out. "Go," Silas ordered. Toby didn't argue. He scrambled on his hands and knees, coughing violently. Silas followed, dragging his useless leg behind him like dead weight. Every inch was a battle. The floorboards were hot enough to burn skin. The smoke was a living thing, clawing at their eyes, blinding them. Toby reached the window and vaulted through, landing in the deep snow outside. Silas reached the sill. He shoved the bundle of his coat, the baby, through first, dropping her gently into the snowbank. Then he gripped the frame. The wood was burning. He could smell his own flesh searing as he pulled his massive bulk up. With a final, desperate heave, he tumbled out of the inferno and collapsed into the freezing drifts. The shock of the cold was instant and violent. It sucked the breath from his lungs. Silas rolled onto his back, gasping, staring up at the night sky. The stars were indifferent, cold pinpricks of light above the smoke. He lay there for a moment, letting the snow numb the fire on his skin. He was alive. "Mama!" Toby's scream shattered the moment. Silas forced himself up on one elbow. The boy was standing near the trail, looking down the mountain. The snow was churned up, marked by the deep, frantic ruts of galloping horses. "They took her!" Toby turned to Silas, his small fist clenched, his face a mask of anguish. "They took her while we were in the hole." Silas looked at the tracks. Paddock. He hadn't just come to kill. He had come to collect. And he had taken the only leverage he thought mattered. Silas sat up, his vision swimming. He looked at his leg. The boot was soaked in blood, the leather torn. It was broken badly. He grabbed a handful of snow and packed it against the wound, hissing through his teeth. "We have to go after them," Toby cried, taking a step toward the dark trail. "We have to save her." "Stop," Silas growled. The command was low, but it had the weight of iron. "But..." You walk down that trail now, you die in a mile, Silas said, his voice steadying. You have no coat, no gun, and Paddock has 5 men, so we just let him kill her. Toby sobbed, collapsing into the snow. Silas didn't answer immediately. He reached into the deep pocket of his buffalo coat to check for a spare shell, hoping he might have one left for the fire-starting kit. His fingers brushed against something cold, hard, heavy. He pulled it out. The firelight from the burning cabin reflected off the object in his palm. It was a ring, massive, gold, set with a ruby the size of a pigeon's egg. The Paddock family crest was engraved into the stone. Silas stared at it. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Clara. In those final chaotic moments before the explosion, when she had wiped the blood from his face, she hadn't just been tending to him. She had been arming him. She knew. She knew Paddock wouldn't leave without her. She knew she was the bait. And she had entrusted Silas with the one thing Paddock wanted more than her life. She had bought him a chance. Silas closed his fist around the ring. The gold bit into his palm. A dark, cold rage settled over him, extinguishing the pain, the fear, and the hesitation. It was a familiar feeling. It was the feeling he had 20 years ago when he rode with the cavalry. It was the feeling of a man who had run out of mercy. Boy, Silas said. The word was sharp, cutting through Toby's sobbing. Toby looked up. Find me a stick, Silas said. Something strong, like a crutch. We're going to town. Toby sniffled, wiping his nose. No, Silas said, looking toward the jagged peaks behind the cabin. We're going to the old mine. The mine? That's the wrong way. Do as I say. Silas barked. Toby scrambled, finding a sturdy branch that had been blown down by the storm. He brought it to Silas. Silas used the branch to leverage himself up. He swayed, the world tilting on its axis, but he did not fall. He tucked the ring into his vest pocket, right over his heart. Wrap the baby tight, Silas ordered. Put her inside your shirt if you have to. Body heat is all she has. They began to walk. It was a nightmare march. The snow was waist-deep in places. Every step Silas took with his left leg sent a shockwave of nausea through him. He sweated despite the freezing wind. He focused on the rhythm. Step. Drag. Breathe. Step. Drag. Breathe. They climbed for an hour, leaving the burning beacon of the cabin behind. They reached a rocky overhang, the entrance to an abandoned silver mine that Silas had used as a root cellar and storage years ago. Silas collapsed against the rock wall, sliding down until he was sitting. Dig, he pointed to a pile of loose shale in the corner of the cave. 3 feet down. There's a box. Toby, exhausted and shivering, fell to his knees and began to dig with his hands. He clawed at the frozen earth and rocks. His fingers bled, but he didn't stop. 10 minutes later, his fingers hit wood. I found it, Toby gasped. Pull it out. It was a heavy, iron-bound chest. Silas dragged it toward him. He didn't have the key. He had thrown it away years ago. So he used a rock to smash the rusted padlock. He threw the lid back. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay the relics of a life Silas had tried to bury. There was a holster, worn smooth by years of use. A box of .45 Schofield ammunition. A heavy, canvas duster coat, stiff with age. And there, gleaming dull blue in the shadows, was the gun. A Smith & Wesson Model 3 Schofield. Top break. Cavalry issue. It was a weapon of war, designed for reloading on horseback, designed for killing efficiently. Silas hadn't touched it since the day he walked away from the army, sick of the blood. He picked it up. It felt heavy, cold, and terrible. It felt like home. He checked the cylinder. Empty. He broke the action open and began to load the cartridges, his large hands moving with a fluid, practiced grace that frightened Toby. Click. 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 Silas snapped the cylinder shut. He shrugged off his burnt buffalo coat and pulled on the canvas duster. It hid his bulk, making him look like a shadow. He strapped the holster to his waist, the weight of the gun settling against his hip. He looked at Toby. The boy was staring at him. He didn't see the hermit who carved wooden ducks anymore. He saw something else. Something dangerous. Mr. Silas, Toby whispered. Who are you? Silas looked at the boy, his eyes hard as flint. I'm the man who's going to get your mother back. He reached into the chest and pulled out a smaller object. A heavy, terrifyingly long Bowie knife. He handed it to Toby. Paddock thinks he's won, Silas said, his voice low and rumbling. He thinks he burned us out. He thinks the world is his to take. He forgot one thing. What? Toby asked, gripping the knife. He forgot that wolves hunt best in the winter. Silas used the cave wall to stand up again. The pain was still there, but it was distant now, fuel for the fire in his gut. We need horses, Silas said. Paddock's men would have left fresh mounts at the relay station at the bottom of the pass. They'll be tired, guarding the rear. We're going to steal them? Toby asked. Silas adjusted his hat. We're going to take them. And if anyone gets in our way, God help them. He looked at the ring in his pocket one last time. Let's go, son, Silas said, limping toward the mouth of the cave, the Schofield tapping against his leg. It's time to pay the devil his due. The Red Rock Ranch was not a farm. It was a fortress. A sprawling estate of timber and stone that sat in the valley like a bloated spider, sucking the life out of the surrounding territory. Inside the main hall, a grand chandelier casting fractured light over polished mahogany tables, Josiah Paddock poured himself a glass of expensive whiskey. He swirled the amber liquid, listening to the crackle of the massive stone fireplace. Clara O'Malley was tied to a high-backed chair in the center of the room. Her face was bruised, her lips split, but her head was held high. You're a fool, Paddock, she said, her voice raspy. You think killing me solves your problem? The bank in San Francisco knows Arthur is dead. Without that ring to verify the transfer, freeze your assets by Monday. Paddock laughed, a wet, arrogant sound. He walked over to her, grabbing her chin. By Monday, I'll have torn that cabin apart and found it. And as for you, well, accidents happen. A grieving widow, distraught over her husband's death, wandering off a cliff. It's a tragedy, really. Dutch Van Doren stood by the door, cleaning his fingernails with a Bowie knife. Boss, the boys are back from the mountain. They said the fire is out, but they didn't find no bodies. Just a lot of ash. Paddock frowned, releasing Clara. Dig deeper. That old hermit didn't survive a stick of dynamite at point-blank range, didn't he? The voice came from the entrance of the hall. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a whip crack. Every head turned. Standing in the double doorway was Silas Halloway. He looked like something dredged up from the grave. His buffalo coat was scorched, his face smeared with soot and dried blood. He was leaning heavily on a crutch made of rough pine, his left leg dragging uselessly behind him. But it was what was in his right hand that froze the room. A Schofield Model 3 revolver. A cavalry gun, long-barreled and deadly. How? Paddock stammered, stepping back. You're dead. I killed you. You tried. Silas grunted, limping forward. Step. Drag. Step. Drag. The sound was rhythmic, terrifying. But you made a mistake, Josiah. You burned my house. You took my peace. And you touched a woman under my protection. Dutch stepped forward, dropping his knife and reaching for his holstered pistol. I'll put him down, boss. He's a cripple. Wait. Silas barked. He reached into his pocket with his free hand, the hand holding the crutch, and pulled out the ring. The heavy gold signet glittered in the firelight. Is this what you want? Silas asked, holding it up. Paddock's eyes widened. Greed washed over his fear. The ring. Give it to me. Dutch. Paddock snapped. Don't shoot him. Get the ring. Dutch smirked. He walked toward Silas, confident. Silas was injured. He was leaning on a crutch. He was an easy target. Hand it over, old man. Dutch sneered, reaching out. Silas looked at the ring, then at Paddock. You built an empire on blood, Paddock. It's fitting you lose it in blood. Silas tossed the ring. He didn't toss it to Dutch. He tossed it high into the air, over Dutch's head, toward the roaring fireplace. No. Paddock screamed, diving past Dutch, scrambling toward the hearth to catch the symbol of his power before it was lost to the flames. In that split second of distraction, the dynamic of the room shifted. Dutch's eyes followed the ring for a fraction of a second. That was all Silas needed. Silas dropped the crutch. Ignoring the agony in his broken leg, he planted his feet. The Schofield roared. Bang. Dutch Van Doren jerked backward, a hole in the center of his forehead. He was dead before he hit the floor. The other three henchmen in the room froze. They looked at Dutch's body, then at the man who had just outdrawn the fastest gun in the territory while standing on one good leg. Walk away. Silas growled, the smoking gun trained on them. Paddock can't pay you anymore. His money is in that fire. The henchmen exchanged glances. They were hired guns, not loyalists. They looked at Paddock, who was on his knees by the fire, burning his hands trying to rake the coals, screaming about his ring. They looked at the dead enforcer. They turned and walked out the door. Silas limped toward Paddock. The cattle baron was sobbing now, clutching the hot gold ring. It was blackened, the ruby cracked by the heat. Paddock looked up, his face smeared with ash, tears streaming down his cheeks. He fumbled for his own gun, on the floor where he dropped it to dive for the ring. Don't, Silas said. Paddock grabbed the gun, swinging it up, a snarl of pure hate on his face. I own this valley. I own you. Silas fired once. Paddock collapsed, the gold-plated revolver clattering from his hand. He slumped against the stone hearth, the cracked ring rolling from his dead fingers, coming to a stop at Silas's boot. Silence descended on the room. Silas lowered the gun. The adrenaline that had sustained him finally crashed. His vision blurred, and his leg gave out. He fell to one knee, gasping for air. Silas! Clara was there in an instant. She had worked her ropes loose during the chaos. Or perhaps the fear of seeing him fall gave her the strength to break them. She fell to her knees beside him, wrapping her arms around his neck. You came. She sobbed into his scorched coat. You came for us. I told you. Silas whispered, wincing as he touched her bruised face. I don't like bullies. The front doors creaked open again. Little Toby stood there, holding the reins of 5 stolen horses, his eyes wide as he looked at the carnage. He saw his mother. He saw Silas, and he ran to them, burying his face in Clara's shoulder. Silas looked at the family huddled around him. For 10 years, he had lived in silence, convinced that he was broken, that he had nothing left to offer the world but his absence. He looked at the dead tyrant by the fire. He looked at the window, where the first light of dawn was breaking over the snow-capped peaks. Is it over? Toby asked, looking at the body of Paddock. Silas reached out and covered the boy's eyes, pulling him close. Yeah, son. Silas said, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't felt in a lifetime. It's over. The storm is gone. And stay in Red Rock. With Paddock dead and his empire crumbling without leadership or funds, the law finally moved in to pick apart the carcass. Silas, Clara, and the children moved west, to Oregon. It took a long time for Silas's leg to heal, and he walked with a limp for the rest of his days. A permanent reminder of the winter on Granite Peak. He never rebuilt the cabin on the mountain. He didn't need the solitude anymore. 6 months later, on a small farm in the Willamette Valley, Silas sat on a porch, whittling a piece of cedar. Toby was chasing a dog in the yard, and Sarah was sleeping in a crib nearby. Clara stepped out onto the porch, placing 2 mugs of coffee on the railing. She rested her hand on his shoulder. You thinking about the mountain? She asked softly. Silas looked up at her, his gray eyes warm and clear. No, Silas said, taking her hand. I was just thinking that for a man who never had a wife and never had children, I turned out to be the richest man alive. He smiled, and for the first time in 20 years, the ghost of Granite Peak was truly at peace. And that is the story of Silas Holloway, the man who thought he wanted to be alone until he found something worth fighting for. It's a reminder that no matter how deep the snow gets, or how powerful the enemy seems, hard karma always comes for those who prey on the weak. Paddock thought his money and his ring made him a king. But in the end, he lost it all to a man who had nothing but grit and a promise to keep. If you enjoyed this story of justice, redemption, and the Wild West, please destroy that like button just like Silas destroyed Paddock's empire. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who loves a good drama, and subscribe so you never miss a new story. I post new narratives every week. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next.